Okay. So, looking at it today, if we're talking about training your muscular system, we want to be able to describe the principles behind like building strength. We already kind of talked about that yesterday, right? We know that the principle of overload is how our body is going to go, oh wow, like I need to get better at this, right? And so then it will sort of develop in order to do that. We'll also talk about the physiologic differences for aerobic versus aerobic power versus like muscle strength. You know, we talk about aerobic, that's your endurance style lifting, right? Sustained low intensity energy versus muscular strength, which is typically unsustainable high intensity energy. We'll also talk a little about the difference between our different types of contractions. I know we've already talked about that before, but we're going to look at that a little bit deeper today. The four methods that we measure strength, which typically you're going to use really just the one, you know, you're going to use the percentage of one rep max, but there are a couple other methods that are out there that we'll discuss that don't actually come up that often. Variable resistance training, something else that does come up, but only in really one kind of specific way. We'll also talk about the role that the nervous system plays in strength, which is obviously absolutely key. You know, obviously our nervous system is actually going to, you know, get stronger in the same way that our muscles will. And a lot of times like strength, which is your ability to actually just like overcome an external resistance, is often more determined by your nervous system than anything else. We'll talk about hypertrophy and hyperplasia. Hyperplasia is kind of interesting. Not one that we're going to necessarily be looking at in humans, but something that can happen. A little bit about muscle soreness. We will talk about that. And then we'll talk about some of the cardio adaptations that come along with strength training. Some of the mistakes that a lot of people make during flexibility training, like, you know, stretching too often or not stretching appropriately. And then we'll talk a little bit about like how it changes as we get older. So, really quickly, I'm just gonna, Paula's texting me. It seems her internet is being funky. Quick, unplug it and plug it back in. All right. So principles of developing strength, right? So if we're talking about like strength, it's a little bit different than just the idea of like having muscle, right? Like strength is, we're going to define it as the amount of force that your muscles can exert, right? So like if your muscles are working, let's say I've got like 100 pounds, you know, barbell on my shoulders. If my two deltoid muscles work together along with my triceps and a little bit of my upper pectoralis major, you know, those muscle fibers all kind of work together to generate more than 100 pounds of force, then I will have enough strength to overcome this external resistance, right? And that's what we're talking about when we talk about strength, and why, you know, everybody has like different levels of strength. And so it's the amount of internal tension that your muscles are able to develop, right? And how does that happen? Well, we've been talking about that a lot in this course, right? It's the different proteins inside of your muscles. It's your ability to produce energy. You know, so there's a lot of different like factors that relate to your strength, whether it's like, you know, how many of those proteins you have, the muscle fiber types. And, you know, and when I say muscle fiber types, remember we're talking about just like their external characteristics, right? Does it have more mitochondria? Does it have more like sarcoplasm, right? More mitochondria is good for low intensity sustained energy. Sarcoplasm, you know, cytoplasm, it is better for like big bursts of intense energy. Gender differences is going to have a big point. Point of tendon insertion. This is kind of a fun one. Your point of tendon insertion actually can have an effect on your strength. I wonder if I can find a good picture of this. Strength consequences, I guess, is not, that's not quite what I'm looking for. Yeah, all right, I can work off this picture. So you can kind of see a little bit of the difference between these two muscles here, right? Like anatomically, this is your hamstring muscle, which you can see is very kind of like long and kind of stretched out like this versus your quadriceps muscles. If you look at it, look at how the fibers actually kind of move off to the side slightly, right? So there's sort of a difference in the shape of these, but also look at like how long their tendons are, right? You can see this is a little short one versus like this one is actually very long. And that's because this muscle, it can exert more force because of like this angle that it has, but it can also exert more. It needs to have like a bigger, stronger tendon to be able to like deal with that, right? And so sometimes you'll see, you know, we develop like imbalances, right? You can like see here, right? We've got, let's say these are two opposite muscles, right? So this is like maybe your quadricep and maybe this is your hamstring. And we see like this tendon's being pulled really long and this one's being pulled really, you know, kind of naturally. That's a muscle imbalance, right? That'd be one side of the joint is imbalanced compared to the other. And so this side's actually contracting. You can see this muscle is in a contracted state here. It's supposed to be this long, right? And so that's pulling on the tendon even more. So, you know, this is probably somebody who's going to pull, if this was their quads over here and this is their hamstring over here, they're probably going to pull a hamstring muscle, right? Or maybe they'll pull a hip flexor if it's on the opposite side. So that's another way of looking at overactive, underactive muscles there. But, you know, sometimes your point of origin, your insertion can affect your strength. It's not quite what I started talking about, but that is a big deal when it comes to like your level of strength. I know that like, when I tore my ACL in high school and I had to go get an MRI, I remember just as like a piece of trivia, you know, the guy was just mentioning, he was like, oh yeah, take a look at your knee, you know, and he was like looking at my knee like crazy and he was looking at all these different pictures and I didn't know how to read anything. I was a high schooler, but he was like, you know, you got a little short tendon back here in your hamstring. And I was like, oh, what does that mean? He's like, well, basically it means that like your hamstrings are going to be really tight. And I was like, that kind of sucks. And he's like, yeah, he's like, it just inserts into a spot where, you know, it's a little shorter than it really should be. And so obviously there's a little bit of like genetic differences there, you know? So that's kind of a fun one. Neurologic activation, that's another really key one here. Your nervous system's ability to control that muscle will determine how strong it is. And then obviously there are certain hormonal factors. We know that growth hormone and testosterone in particular are very good anabolic hormones that result in like muscular growth. I was just reading about this story about this, like, you know, I think he was like a teenager and he was like way taller than his dad and his mom and anybody else in his family. And they were just like, man, you just somehow got the giant gene. And then it turned out, and they, you know, he kept growing and growing, and they were like, man, like, yeah, you're really tall. And they ended up going into the doctor, and they found like a small little growth on his thyroid. And so he had like a little tiny tumor that they ended up removing, but that was basically causing him to spit out growth hormone way more than he was supposed to. And so, you know, it caused him to grow really tall. Because that's the thing about growth hormone, right? Like a lot of people, like bodybuilders will sometimes be like, oh, I want to take growth hormone, it'll make me bigger. And it's like, they should relabel human growth hormone. I mean, they shouldn't actually relabel it. It's perfectly named as it is, but they should teach people what it means. But if they relabeled it HSGH, human stuff growing hormone, I feel like that would actually like describe it a little bit better, and people would be a little less cautious, a little more cautious about taking it. Human growth hormone grows anything that is your human tissue. It doesn't just grow your muscles. I mean, we want it, you know, the thing we see is like muscle growth in people, right? But like it grows everything. Your bones get denser and larger. And that can be a good thing, but also sometimes connective tissue or organs, you know, like this is why like it's been associated with causing diabetes. Because like your pancreas will create lots and lots of insulin because it gets huge and it's like, yeah, I'm great at creating insulin. And then your cells in your body become resistant to that insulin because you have such high elevated levels. And then my favorite side effect of human growth hormone supplementation, this is a weird one, but I think it like really describes what I'm talking about here. You will get carpal tunnel syndrome. I shouldn't say will. You can get carpal tunnel syndrome from human growth hormone, which is weird because you're like, wait a minute, Because what carpal tunnel syndrome is, without doing too much of a sidetrack here, but if I look it up here, is where your fascia, right over here on your at your wrist, right? It gets so tight it starts pinching this little nerve right here. It's called your median nerve. And that's the nerve that spreads out to like the rest of your hand. And so if you grow this connective tissue and it gets so thick that it starts poking a nerve, again, we don't want to poke nerves. It's a big part of our nerve, a big part of our anatomy is like we don't disrupt our nerves, because nerves, when they get touched, they create signals, right? And so that's sort of what causes carpal tunnel, and that's why human growth hormone. So stay away from that crap, unless your doctor gives it to you for medical reasons, in which case, listen to your doctor and get on that crap. So, all right. Let's go ahead and talk a little bit about like developing our strength, right? If we're talking about, strength, overcoming external resistance. And that's actually, that's not even necessarily true. It's the amount of force that we're exerting against a resistance. That's actually the definition of strength. Doesn't mean we're always overcoming that resistance, right? But we've got sort of three ways that we produce strength, right? And these are our contractions that you guys have seen before. You'll notice I put in a little bit of extra information here. First one, we've got concentric contractions. These are contractions that occur when your muscle is shortening, right? So you can, if you see your bicep bunch up like that, right? That bunching up action is because all those actin myosin proteins are sliding across one another. And so like that is a concentric contraction. If you're generating more force in your muscle than whatever resistance you are working against, your muscle will shorten and it will overcome that external resistance. That's why we call this force production, right? Like if we're talking about like producing force. Now, obviously, we need to write this in our workouts sometimes because we're trying to get people to lift at specific tempos. So if you were to write like a 2-0-2 tempo or a 4-2-1 tempo, whenever we're listing out tempos, right, the first number is representing eccentric, the middle number is representing isometric, and that third number is representing the concentric force production part of the lift. Remember, it always goes in this order, even if your lift starts concentrically first, which would technically mean that I would start counting. Like if I was doing a 4-2-1 tempo, I would go 1, and then I would go 1, 2. I do the isometric, and then I would go 1, 2, 3, 4, right? So I would actually go sort of in reverse order here. So this is not meant to represent like the order that your client lifts in. It's meant to represent always concentric, isometric, eccentric. So concentric is the shortening, right? It's responsible for, generally, this is what people think of when they think of contracting, right? It's how your muscle is actually like squeezing in order to do things. So in resistance training, obviously, we do a lot of concentric contractions. Generally, it's the one that people put the most emphasis in because I think it's where you do kind of feel like you are working the hardest. And I think this is another one of those examples of where like what you feel like you are doing kind of gets in the way of what you are actually trying to do when it comes to strength training sometimes, right? Like if I look up my best example of this, if I look up like Superman exercise, you'll see a million pictures on the internet. You'll see some good ones, you'll see some bad ones, right? This girl right here, crushing it. She is killing it. This is perfect form. Her head is in line naturally with her spine, right? This girl right here, killing it. Love it. Fantastic. This guy right here, bringing his head up because it feels like you're doing more work, right? You're trying to recruit. It's like, oh, I'm exercising. I should do as much work as possible. And that's not always true. A lot of times you see, it's all guys that are doing it wrong. Shocker. There's a little forward head. There we go. It's always guys who pay the least attention in group exercise. You just wait and experience that. You teach your first group exercise class, you'll notice every guy is out there just like zoning out, doing their own thing, like, I'm so buff. So anyway, that's your concentric, that's an example of like people doing too much because it feels like when you're concentrically lifting, you're like trying to beat this force. You're like, come on, I can do it. I can defeat you, So it feels, here and here, like you're doing a little bit more work, right? And so a lot of people put a lot of emphasis on the concentric stuff. They don't put any emphasis on either eccentric or isometric. So you'll see people like, they'll be like, oh, God, and they're working really hard. And then they go, oh, and they work really hard again. And it's like, man, like you just missed 2/3 of the lift that you're doing, you know? So eccentric contractions are also really big. This is contracting when your muscle is lengthening, right? So, you know, if your muscle is generating less tension than some type of resistive force, the muscle is going to get pulled apart. It's going to lengthen, right? That's what we call this force reduction. So if I were like lowering something down, I'd be generating less force. You know, if something was falling, right, it would have a lot of force. It'd be picking up velocity and force as it's like falling down. And I would, you know, make initial contact. And I would generate a lot of force, and I'd probably like slow the amount of force that I'm generating. If I generate too much force right away, it'll bounce right off my hands. But if I kind of cradle it as it's coming down and I eccentrically decelerate it, that's going to be a much more effective catch, right? And so that is where we get our tempo. That's the first number that's going to be listed. Now, when it comes to eccentric lifts, and it comes to like hypertrophy, actually talking about the difference between concentric and eccentric lifts, parallel hypertrophy versus, shoot, what's the opposite of parallel? Oh no. Perpendicular, no, that's not right. Perpendicular hypertrophy versus parallel hypertrophy. That's not correct. That's not what I'm looking for. Yeah, longitudinal. What's the other term for that? All right, well, anyway, there is sort of like two different ways that you can experience like hypertrophy growth, right? Hypertrophic growth. When we talk about like developing more actin and myosin proteins, you'll see sort of two different versions of this, right? Remember, hypertrophy means to grow a muscle fiber, right? It means to make it larger, right? So if you were to stack, you know, here we can see like there's a myosin in the middle, and then there's all these little actin strands on either side, right? Notice how there's two lines of actin and myosin strands here. So they stacked in parallel with one another like this, right? That is one version of hypertrophy. Now I've got a big muscle cell, right? But what if I decided instead to stack them in length like this, right? You know, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 actin, 6 sarcomeres in this picture here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 sarcomeres in this version here. So originally there were 3, and then we got stronger, so we developed 6 in either version here, right? Those are both versions of hypertrophic growth. Both of those will make your muscle cells larger, right? So if that's the case, if both of those are really good examples, thank God I found that picture, because I still can't think of the term. It's like it's not penultimate. But anyway, both versions of that, right? Either stacking them wider this way or stacking them longer this way are versions of hypertrophy, and they are associated with the different portions of the lift. Generally, concentric contractions result in stacking them this way. So that is like, you know, a short fat muscle, versus eccentric lengthening is associated with more stacking them this way, sort of length at end to end. This is why eccentric contractions are probably more associated with what we call DOMS, or delayed onset muscle soreness. Lorianne, I know you're very familiar with this term after we mentioned it the other day. And it's where it's like, yeah, you were sore the day after your workout, but whew, day 2 is way worse, right? Sometimes day 3. But that's a gradual discomfort or inflammation that occurs anywhere from 24 to 48 hours, sometimes longer, after a workout. And this is heavily associated with eccentric contractions in particular. So the longer you do an eccentric contraction, the more likely you are to have greater levels of DOMS. This is what sort of led to a lot of trainers doing like negative, we'll do bicep curls, just because that's like always a really popular one. But you'll see people do like negative lifts, right? And you would need it in order to do like a good negative. Actually, negative preacher curl. Let's try that. That's the one that's always really popular in like a lot of weightlifting rooms. Yeah, so you'll see like, here's the preacher curl, right? It's the one with the elbows here. I can't believe I'm not seeing a picture. Where's like, you need a gym partner. Yeah, there we go. So what a negative will be is like, let's say this guy here, he's able to bicep curl. Let's say, I don't know what that's a 1-inch bar. So that's probably 65 or yeah, 65 pounds right there. So if he's doing like 65 pounds, right? That's what he's able to do. Well, if he had a gym partner who was able to like help him do the concentric portion of the lift, and he were to go with like, let's say 80 pounds, which is way beyond what he can actually do, he will try to resist it as it comes down, and he'll do the eccentric portion of the lift. Then he'll get help and bring it back up again, and then he'll do the eccentric portion of the lift. So that's really popular amongst bodybuilders. And I think for two reasons. Number one, yeah, there's some science behind it, right? Eccentric lengthening, really great for hypertrophy, at least in terms of like parallel. But it is more, I think the reason it's so popular is because it is associated with feeling like your workout was more effective, like you are more sore the next day. And for the record, soreness is not an indicator of how good or bad your workout was, because soreness is associated with like a lot of different things. Could just be a really strong immune response. Some people actually just feel more sore than others do. It could be associated with maybe you were doing more eccentric lifts. It could be associated with the fact that you just had a big lactic acid production. Maybe you even got nauseous and then you didn't cool down. That nausea means that you produced lots of lactic acid. And then since you didn't cool down, you didn't get rid of any of it. So it just got to sit there and burn and create even more damage, making you more sore. So there's, again, soreness is not a great indicator of how effective your workout is. And we want to, translate that information to our clients. I tell my clients that all the time, especially because like you'll always be very sore after you switch like your routine, right? You're always sore on like a new routine or when you start doing any physical activity, because your immune system's like, what are you doing? This is not what we were used to doing. And then, that gradually goes away over the next couple of weeks. It doesn't mean the next couple of weeks your workout didn't do anything. That totally doesn't mean that. It just means that, you had a much bigger sort of response the first time because it was new and scary to your system. And then our last contraction, isometrics. So isometrics, this is a term, these are contractions that are occurring when the muscle is contracting for the exact same amount of force as whatever resistance it is, right? So if I push my hands together like this and I generate an equal amount of force on both sides, I'm not going to move in either direction, right? So that's an isometric stabilization. When you think about like your quads and your hamstrings both pulling on both sides of the knee joint, right, to keep your knee nice and stable, that's isometric stabilization, right? So this is the muscle generating an equal tension to the resistive force. You got 100 pounds of force, you generate 100 pounds, whoop, and you can just kind of hold it there, right? Force stabilization. This is the middle number, by the way, right? This is the middle number in our tempo. This is the one that actually does make sense because you're like, yeah, it would be the middle, like in between one and the other. And what's great about isometric exercises is, like I said, it's really big on learning how to resist movement, right? One of the reasons we spend so much time focusing on core stabilization exercises, right? Exercises that don't move your spine is because they are isometric, and it's about training your body to learn how to stabilize and hold something in the position it's supposed to be in, rather than just focusing on learning how to move that thing all the time. We love movement, but like movement without stability is dangerous, right? So that's why NASM has so many unstable exercises where you have to hold your body in a specific position and stabilize, right? So the one thing to be aware of, though, that I do want to mention, isometric exercises do dramatically increase your blood pressure. And that's because of how much internal tension you're generating, which causes you to kind of stay put. A lot of times it also causes people to hold their breath, which even further increases their blood pressure. We like isometrics, but with clients who have hypertension, it's something that we want to avoid. So you would do like stabilization exercises, but for the most part, you wouldn't do the big long pauses. You would just want to kind of keep them moving. We talk more about that in our special populations class. So Bay, that should sound familiar, but Lorianne, we'll get to that later down the road. But yeah, that's a big thing that we talk about all the time. It's like, you know, if your client does have blood pressure issues and they are like at risk for passing out, you know, we don't want to move their head around too much because we're not trying to make them dizzy. And we're also going to make sure that we don't do too many isometrics. Okay, so the next thing we're going to look at is how we measure strength, right? So we got a lot of different ways that we can measure strength. You know, the most common version is going to be the 1 rep max test. But we got a couple other ones first, so I'm going to mention them here. There is cable tensiometry, which is basically where you will have a machine that has a little cable that runs through it, and as somebody generates force, it's kind of feeling how much like force is kind of moving its way through these little rotors right here. This is good for strength training, but you know, they're trying to basically exert force consistently for like 5 seconds. It doesn't move much, by the way. It's not a very great example of like their strength through the entire range of motion, because like this doesn't have any way to account for range of motion. It's just one big straight line, right? So that's an okay version, and sometimes like specific for certain things. Like I said, usually it's going to be in like very specific settings though. There's dynamometers, which is about squeezing actions. These are usually your hands and legs. So like a dynamometer can test your grip strength, for instance. And actually, I don't think these aren't that expensive, are they? Dynamometers. Oh, shit, no, shopping. I guess, yeah, $100, it's kind of expensive. But yeah, like they're okay. Oh, there we go. There's a $20 one. So like these will be really popular. Like rock climbers will often like own one of these, and they're like testing their grip strength, you know, to be able to like obviously not fall off a mountain. But it doesn't come up in a typical gym setting all that often. However, I will say this, just as a quick little fun fact side note, an increased level of grip strength has been associated with long life. The greater a grip strength, there's sort of a direct correlation between people who have goodly amounts of grip strength and living longer, and having lower blood pressure and things like that. Now, I will say, I think that that's probably just because it's like, yeah, well, those are probably active people who are fit people, and fit people live longer. But that's like a fun fact that I think is mentioned at some point in your textbook, just like randomly. It's not something you'll be tested on, but just like a little like fun little spark note. And then this picture shouldn't be here. This is not a picture. Don't ignore the dynamometer over here. The big one that we're going to use, 1 rep max. This is how we are going to measure strength oftentimes in the gym, right? And this is a measurement of the maximal weight or maximal tension that you can generate, or weight you can lift in a single repetition, right? And it's great. Like this is a really, really terrific way to measure someone's strength, right? If I really want to figure out like what your maximum potential is, this is a great tool for me to have. And then I can work at specific intensities, right? So really good at making it easier for you to apply progressive overload for your clients, you know? If we look at like progressive overload powerlifting example, talking about powerlifting in particular, 2 weeks out, final week. No. I'm looking for like a scheduled one where someone's kind of laid this out for me, so I don't have to make it up. There we go. So take a look right here. You can see like, all right, if I knew that your 1 rep max is, let's say 100 pounds, right? Well, the first week I'd have you do squats for 70 pounds for 8 repetitions. And then that would be like, oh shoot, this is totally not what I was looking for. I thought this was several weeks worth of differences. I'm looking at different days. Well, either way, like if you were doing, so 70% would work really well for 8 repetitions, but if you were doing 80% for 3 repetitions, that would also be very effective. For 85%, where you're really trying to like push it all the way up to 4 repetitions. So this middle day is less reps and less intensity. And so this is obviously clearly like a little bit of a rest day for this lift. And then like we hit it really hard at the end of the week before resetting and bringing the intensity back down. And the idea here is that like this will push your 1 rep max and raise your intensity slowly over the weeks, right? And so we see the kind of the wakes, yeah, the weight go up as the weeks go up. Next thing we're going to look at is how we actually develop strength. We did talk about the 3 different types of contractions we have. Well, obviously we need to like do different things to develop strength in all 3 versions of those contractions. One of them will be isometrics. You know, if you do isometric training, this is training that involves like super sustained periods of like stabilized movements. When you think of like the plank, that's an isometric exercise. When you think about like doing like a floor bridge where you hold it, that's an isometric exercise, right? There's always usually actually on this day in class, normally I would take a little break right here and I would make everyone do this. Moby flower push-ups. There's this song by Moby called Flower, and it only has a few lyrics in it. And what you do is you listen to that song and then you try to do push-ups in tempo with what the lyrics are telling you to do. So whenever it says this is gonna say bring Sally up. And when it says bring Sally up, you come up on the push-up. And when it says bring Sally down, you drop down below. And you hold until you are told to come back up again. And so your push-ups look something kind of like this. This is kind of like a techno song, so it's literally just this for X number of minutes. You know, it's just like kind of a random beat in the background. But lots of isometric stabilization, right? And you'll see, I'm sure everybody in here is gonna like drop out halfway. Honestly, I've actually never made it through this whole thing. I've tried to do it a couple times, but I've never been able to make it. I can do it with squats, but that's kind of a fun one, right? It's isometric. Obviously, there's a little bit of like eccentric and concentric movement there, but for the most part, you're learning how to stabilize. We've also got progressive resistance training. This is what we talked about yesterday, right? Progressive resistance training is a method of increasing the ability of your muscles to generate force by continuing to progress the amount of force that they have to generate every workout, or as often as possible. So basically, again, working, it's like, hey, this used to be your 1 rep max, but we've been working on each other for a little while now. Let's make it a little bit heavier. Boom. Now you have progressed them. You're progressively overloading, right? There's also variable resistance training. This is kind of fun. This is usually performed on a very special machine, or resistance bands can be an example of this. But variable resistance training is where the amount of intensity will change as you move through different ranges of motions. So resistance bands can actually be a good example of this. The end, it's a rubber band. So the further you get away, the more force it's pushing against you. So variable resistance training tends to be pretty good for concentric force production. Not exactly great for eccentric lengthening unless that force is like really intense. It's good for eccentric lengthening in the end range. You'll also sometimes see this in gyms. This is kind of, I always think it's a little cheesy when you see this in gyms. Have you ever seen like bench press with chains? Yeah. So if you've ever seen, people will actually like bring these big, heavy chains into the gym with them. And what they'll do is they'll attach it to the bench as they're doing it. Are you literally not going to do it in the video? In the video where you were talking about it? There are so many dumb YouTube. There we go. All right. So you can see like when he's down low, there's not a lot of like force from these chains here. But as he concentrically lifts through, now there's more force pushing on it, right? So that's kind of the example there, right? That's what it looks like when you're setting these things up. And it's variable, right? Like it gets harder in your end range of motion. So if you are having problem with like end range of motion strength, resistance bands, chains, if you have access to them, nobody ever does, but if you did, that could be a good way to kind of overcome that. A lot of people have trouble locking out their deadlift at the end. And so this can be an effective kind of tool to overcome that. We got isokinetic training. This is one that definitely requires a special machine. This is a special machine that basically keeps your muscle to where it can only contract at a very specific pace. So if we look at like an isokinetic machine, you'll see these are these like little, you'll often see it. Yeah, the quadriceps is the big one. So you'll see people like she can only contract at a specific pace the entire time. I liken it to, and it's not exactly this, but I think it's similar to like when you go to open, like when you go to open a door and then you let it go and you close it and it's like, it closes pretty rapidly, but then it slows down at the end because there's the little like air pressure tube thing that keeps it from slamming. So it's like it falls and then it kind of slows down, right? And it's kind of like that when you're opening doors too. Sometimes if you try to open them too quickly, it'll push even harder against you. So if you open it slowly, it'll kind of let go. That's kind of what isokinetic training is at, only through the entire range of motion, right? So the harder you push doesn't really matter, you're only allowed to move so fast. This is pretty good for coming back from an injury from like surgery and stuff, because it ensures that you're not going to like panic the muscle by contracting it too quickly. And then there's the exact opposite of isokinetic training, which is plyometric training. Plyometric training is the explosive stuff, right? So these are methods that are focusing primarily on rate of force production. So we don't care about how much weight you can lift. We care about how fast you can lift it, right? Now there is definitely like a lot of strength that comes along with this. So it will enhance your muscle strength, but it's very good for enhancing your muscle power because it's focused primarily on velocity. And remember, strength, force, strength is nothing more than force production, and force is, power is force times velocity, right? So the overall power output that you have is the amount of force that you are generating times your velocity, right? And that will, it never actually comes up when I try to Google it. But that's how we're generating, that's how we're measuring power, right? So velocity is the speed. There's definitely some carryover there, and it can enhance your strength. And so it does this also through like those stretch shortening cycles that we mentioned last module, that myotactic stretch reflex. Your nerves are designed, if we look at like what a stretch reflex is, right? A stretch reflex is where you basically stretch something really rapidly. And so it sends a signal, to your muscle that says, whoa, we just lengthened out really fast. And so then that muscle decides to contract in the opposite direction. So when your doctor smacks you on the knee with that little hammer thing, they hit you right under this little tendon right here. So there's your quadriceps muscle, and then your quadriceps tendon would be this whole section right here. And if they smack it, that tricks your nervous system into thinking that you just stretched your quad out. And so imagine like bringing your heel to your butt, but you did it at freaking light speed, right? And so your nervous system freaks out, right? The signal from smacking it is going to go into the quadriceps muscle, and it's going to say, wow, we just got overly stretched. And so what it'll do in response to keep it from tearing, because it thinks that overstretching is going to result in a muscle tear, is that it will send a signal back in the other direction, the antagonist muscle to relax, and it'll send a contraction to your agonist muscle to contract it and keep it from lengthening. If it thinks that it's afraid of being pulled this way, it will contract in this way. And then the opposite muscle on the other side of the joint will allow that contraction to take place and relax. This is what we do when we do dynamic stretches, right? We swing a muscle through a full range of motion that stretches the antagonist on one side and accelerates the concentric agonist on the other side. So then this muscle that's being rapidly lengthened decides to contract, and then this muscle decides to relax. And we just use that back and forth, right? High knees, butt kickers, all those different exercises that we were doing. So here's an example of a stretch reflex, right? When he goes down really rapidly and he jumps up and then he lands really rapidly and then jumps again, he's getting a stretch reflex here and he's getting a stretch reflex here because he's experiencing, rapid length. So he'll get a little bit here, but he'll get a huge one because like when he's landing, his body's going to accelerate faster and faster and faster as it gets closer to the ground. And then when it hits the ground, he's at, a lot of velocity. So his muscles will rapidly lengthen. That's going to cause them to panic, and then that will cause them to contract. So when he contracts, he will then spring off and make this big, strong concentric contraction. And that's why we're seeing, deceleration, stabilization, deceleration, acceleration, right? So those are all like the different various methods for strength training, but one that we got to talk about that can be applied to all of them and is sort of a global thing is the idea of periodization. So periodization is how we organize various training intensities over the course of like a given time period, typically like a year, or a couple months. But periodization is how we organize like those different intensities. So if we look at an example of like periodization, NASM's actually got a pretty good thing here, if I remember right. Yeah, so you can actually see if you look in this picture right here. Whoa, that is super pixelated. Really, that is not clear. So here we go. If you look at like periodization here, you can see they kind of kept this person pretty. This is a pretty simple routine, right? So this is a mass building program. They're trying to like put on some muscle. So they're focusing on doing stabilization in January, strength endurance in February. And there's some hypertrophy here, right? This is very much that sarcoplasmic hypertrophy because it tends to be high repetition, pretty low intensity. And then we get a little bit of like hypertrophy training here in phase 3 once we get to March. And that's where it's like, okay, well, now we're lifting a little bit heavier. This is going to have a little bit more, this is going to be more associated with myofibrillar hypertrophy. And then we go back to phase 2 in the next month. So we lower the intensity down, then we raise the intensity back up. And then we go into max strength. So very much like some major myofibrillar hypertrophy right there at the end. Then we're back into July, where we kind of reset everything. After max strength, that's very intense. So we go back into stabilization there to kind of give the body a little bit of a break, a little bit of a rest, and a little deload there. And then we go back through the same cycle we went through. Phase 2, then to phase 3, phase 4 again, phase 3, phase 2. So this would be a pretty good program for somebody who's trying to pack on muscle. And then you can see here is the month of June, which was spent in phase 4. So you can see they're doing like probably an upper lower routine, I would assume. Upper on Monday, lower on Tuesday, upper on Thursday, lower on Friday. If I had to guess, I'm actually, no guarantees on that last part. Yeah, I don't see it. I was going to confirm my suspicions. So that's an example of periodization, right? It's how we lay things out in the long term for our clients. And it's a big part of strength training because you want to make sure that your client doesn't plateau, and you also want to make sure that they don't get injured. So we use periodization to vary the intensity and make our body develop different physiologic responses to exercise. Like I said, like strength endurance is really good for sarcoplasmic hypertrophy. It makes the fluid in your cells puff up because your body goes, man, we need to produce lots of lactic acid to be able to get through this almost long sustained exercise, but still relatively like, high intensity stuff. And so you get like a lot more like cytoplasm, so you can get better at producing lactic acid. Then in hypertrophy, you're focusing on heavier loads where it's like, yeah, now I'm still getting the same kind of like sarcoplasm thing, but like luckily I built that foundation the month before, but now I'm able to lift much heavier. So I'm focusing on developing more actin, myosin proteins within the muscle. So by varying your intensities, you are going to shorten the recovery time in between phases of training. You're going to ensure that your client never overtrains, which is a big deal. Any questions so far, guys? You guys feeling good?
Good.
Cool, cool. All right. Let's take a look here at talking about power, right? So developing muscular power. Power is, like I said, it's speed times strength, right? Which means power equals force times velocity. Force is the amount of tension your muscle is generating. Velocity is the speed of the contraction. So another way to say power is rate of force production. So it's how fast you can generate however much force you're trying to generate, right? So to maximize your power output, we tend to learn, we tend to focus more on developing lots of motor units and using those type 2, generally type 2X muscle fibers, right? So this is why we actually do like, if we are trying to develop power, very heavy, but trying to be explosive during the lift, resistance training. So, when you look at like our example tempos we had earlier, we had the 4-2-1, 2-0-2 examples, but there's also XXX, right? Which just basically means it's like we want all 3 phases of the contraction to be as short as possible. Now, here's the thing. Anybody who's ever done heavy lifting, like heavy strength training, I mean, like I pulled up the picture yesterday of the guy who, or I pulled the video yesterday, Eddie Hall, when he did like the world record deadlift, right? Literally like set the world record by lifting 1,100 freaking pounds, which is absolutely just insane. And then afterwards, he's like completely exhausted and just like shut down, but look at how slow he does it, like, that's a lot of weight. It's not exactly going to move quickly, right? He's barely getting it. Come on, little bit. There you go. Lock it out. There it is. Done. Like, it's kind of slow. The point is that he's trying to move fast. So it is still listed as an XXX tempo. He definitely went fast on the way down. We were ready to drop the weight, right? So what that does when you recruit things very heavy and when you recruit them very explosively, right? What you're going to get is you're going to get maximum motor unit recruitment. Your nervous system is going to go, wow, we need all hands on deck, get all the neurons firing for this one, right? That's motor unit recruitment. And by the way that works, when you look at motor unit recruitment, yes, that's what I want. Your body actually, you know what? This is even better. Your nervous system will actually recruit those muscle fibers like this. So when we talk about recruitment, let's say your muscles in your nervous system will always try to get as much work done with as little effort as possible, which kind of sucks because we're going to the gym and it's like, no, I'm trying to put in effort. Like that's the whole point of why I'm here for. But the reason it'll do that is because this is one of the ways that we control how strong our contractions are. Remember how I mentioned, actually, is it in this? It might be in these notes. Hold on. Okay, it's not. So one of the ways that our muscles work, right? We talked about this a couple days ago, is the all or nothing principle, right? Your muscle fiber, when it does fire, it either fires for all of its force or none of it. It can't do a partial contraction. So how do we have like strong contractions and weak contractions? Well, that has to do with how we recruit motor units, right? Let's say I go to pick something up off the floor and it only weighs maybe like 5 or 10 pounds, right? As I go to pick that up, my body will recruit as very few motor units as possible. So it'll maybe recruit enough weight to lift 1 pound. And then it'll go, oh, nope, we still didn't overcome it. And so then it'll try 2 pounds, and then 3 pounds worth of muscle, and then 4 pounds until eventually it gets enough weight to where it can overcome that resistive force. So you can see initially you'll fire, these weaker motor neurons at first, and then you'll recruit some more, and then you'll recruit some more, right? And you'll get more and more muscle fibers until eventually you've got every muscle fiber possible activated. That is motor unit recruitment. And how do you trigger that to happen? You lift really big freaking weights. The heavier you lift, the more you will get a very intense nervous system response, right? So phase 4 and phase 5 of the OPT model, where we are training type 2X muscle fibers, right? Those are the muscle fibers where, yeah, there's a lot of actin and myosin in those muscle fibers. So we are recruiting them, very strong. And this is how we're able to control our strength, Another one that we've got is the idea of what we call motor unit firing frequency, motor unit firing rate, or we sometimes call it rate coding. And this is how quickly your nervous system is able to fire signals, because that's the other thing about muscles, right? They don't just like contract and they're just told to hold there. It's a constant signal from the nervous system. So one of the other ways that we control our contractions, one of the other ways that like determines how strong something is how quickly the signals are sending. So let's say like I want to make a really weak contraction. My nervous system might send a signal at a frequency like this. I don't know what this frequency is, but it's pretty low, right? Versus like a really powerful contraction, which my nervous system will send a signal like this, right? Where it's like traveling much, much, much faster. A nervous system signal that's slow is a weak contraction. A nervous signal that's fast is a very powerful contraction, right? So that is your motor unit firing rate or your motor frequency or rate coding. NASM doesn't usually use the term rate coding. I mean, it's in here, but like they don't use that often in the regular textbook. They'll call it motor unit firing frequency. So how do we get strength? Now we got 2 ways, right? We're going to develop strength, motor unit recruitment, motor unit firing rate. And then there's one other one, which is motor unit synchronization. Now this isn't so much about like control of your muscles, like controlling like the amount of strength. Like your body will not purposefully unsync your muscle fibers to have like a weaker contraction. But synchronized muscle fibers are always going to be much stronger and more efficient than unsynchronized. So like imagine you've got 2 different neurons and they're both firing at the same time. That's a pretty strong contraction versus at like, the pace is all off. They're just a little bit unsynced. I always like to think of it as if you've ever done like a tug of war, and you're on the back, you're there like pulling on this rope and there's another group of team, and you've got people behind you or people in front of you. If I need to like reset my grip right as the person behind me tries to get like a big, strong pull, they're going to be pulling on their own for a second while I'm resetting. And then all of a sudden I get a good grip and I'm like, yeah, now, and then I give a big, strong pull. And then the next person is like resetting because like we were just not in time with one another. That's not going to be very effective. This is why if you've ever done a tug of war, the trick to winning is one person goes 1, 2, 3, pull, and then everybody works as hard as they can. 1, 2, 3, pull. Everyone works as hard as they can. 1, 2, 3, pull. If you sync up like that, it ensures that you're working as hard as you can, and that's how you're going to generate as much force and as much power as possible. So, how do we trigger motor unit recruitment? We lift really heavy. How do we trigger motor unit firing rate? Well, we try to lift fast, at least if we can, try to be explosive and again, also lift heavy. And then how do we get motor unit synchronization? This is the tough one. This is one of the reasons why we take such a long rest period in between sets, because you're trying to do like exposure to these first 2 over and over and over again over the course of, let's say, 4 to 6 sets, right? So if my nervous system gets really turned on in set 1, and it's like, right, it's in panic mode, because that's my autonomic, sympathetic nervous system, then it's in panic mode, right? So I'm getting ready to do set number 2 and my nervous system's already firing like crazy. And then I go to recruit. Well, they're not going to be in sync because some of those fibers were still firing from panicking because of the last, big heavy lift, right? So taking a long rest period, not only does that ensure that you are restoring all of your ATP PC stores, which we know is also really great for heavy lifting, right? Not only does that ensure that you have plenty of ATP recovery, it also ensures that you are giving your nervous system time to calm down between sets before you go and turn it all back on again. So that's big, right? That's another way. That is why, if you've ever seen the OPT model, when we're looking at it, phases 4 and phase 5, both of those have 1 to 5 repetitions at 85 to 100% of your 1 rep max, with a 3 to 5 minute rest period. That ensures that we have motor unit recruitment, motor unit firing rate, and motor unit synchronization. Any questions on that one, guys? That's kind of a long one, big concept. You two doing good?
Yeah.
Cool. All right, so now let's say you do all this stuff, right? Let's say like it's like, all right, well, great. Now I'm doing. What happens when you do it? What happens when you start training all these things? Well, there's a lot of adaptations that come along with resistance training when you lift heavy weights. Some of them are neural, like we talked about, right? You'll see an increase in strength and power, but then all of a sudden you're like, well, why aren't my muscles getting any bigger? And it's like, well, you're getting stronger because your brain now knows how to do a squat properly, not so much because it developed more actin and myosin proteins. You developed your nervous system, right? So if we think about like increasing our ability to stabilize and our proprioception, those are really great ways to like strengthen your nervous system. They're not necessarily the greatest ways to get like enlargement of muscle fibers, right? So neural adaptations. This is why sometimes you'll see like Olympic weightlifters, sometimes they won't be that big and they'll still be really freaking strong. And it's like, how is somebody so tiny able to like lift that much weight over their head? And it's like, well, their nervous system is just super efficient and knows how to do that lift better than anybody, So that's kind of fun. Obviously, there's hypertrophy. We talked about that to death yesterday. But the enlargement of muscle fibers, right? And this is either going to come from, an increase in the actin and myosin proteins this way, or maybe this way, or it'll come from an increase in the sarcoplasm. So having more cytoplasm within those muscles, right? That'll obviously result in that as well. Then we've got power adaptations, right? You will also develop more power because obviously if you are creating greater levels of force, remember force times velocity, it's half the power equation. So, even if you've never done a plyometric a day in your life, but you've done like heavy lifting, it'll translate pretty well and you'll be pretty powerful, pretty explosive. Now, one thing here that we see, muscle adaptations, you'll also sometimes see hyperplasia. And hyperplasia is a little bit different than hypertrophy. Hypertrophy, trophy does mean growth, right? I want to make sure my trophy prefix. Or suffix. Yeah, it means nourishment or growth. Yeah. So trophy means growth. So atrophy is opposite growth. So that means like shrinkage. Hypertrophy, hyper means lots of. So lots of growth, muscle growth, right? But you'll also sometimes see like hyperplasia. Now, hyperplasia is a little bit different. Hyperplasia is actually the increase in the number of muscle fibers that you have, right? So if we look here, right, we got a muscle cell here, 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 here. If you have more cells, that is hyperplasia. If you have larger cells, that is hypertrophy. So when we increase the actin and myosin proteins, we are experiencing hypertrophy because we're making the fibers within the cells larger, which is making the cells larger. And then we've got like, hyperplasia, which is like an increase in the number of, like, that's the increase in the number of cells. this happens indirectly in humans. We don't have like a way of training for this directly. It's something that happens much more frequently, as like we're growing and things like that. But it's not necessarily like making your cells any larger. We're not really training for hyperplasia, even if it does happen to happen. So something to be aware of there. Now, obviously, we talked about like the idea of muscle soreness a little bit earlier, right? Where is soreness? Where is muscle soreness coming from? Well, that's coming from small tears in your muscle fibers, right? You are damaging the actin myosin proteins. Remember earlier we mentioned like a tug of war? Well, your actin myosin proteins are kind of doing that, right? They're like grabbing and then pulling something, and then they're grabbing and pulling it, and they're grabbing and they're pulling it, right? So the actin strand is moving this way. Imagine if you did like 20 tug of wars in a day. By the end, you didn't wear gloves the whole time. Your hands are going to get worn down. You're going to be completely like torn up. You're going to have blisters and, all kinds of problems. That is one of the reasons why we experience muscle soreness. That cellular damage from simply just doing work will result in your body going, wow, we need to fix all of this. And so your immune system will have an inflammatory response. So I got a kind of a fun video here. Let's kind of explain this. This is one of my favorite freaking videos. I think I show this multiple times here in this course, but I love this. TED muscle growth. What makes our muscles grow, right? Well, this is gonna kind of show you what happens in that inflammatory response.
Muscles. We have over 600 of them. They make up between 1/3 and 1/2 of our body weight. And along with connective tissue, they bind us together, hold us up, and help us move. And whether or not bodybuilding is your hobby, muscles need your constant attention because the way you treat them on a daily basis determines whether they will wither or grow. Say you're standing in front of a door, ready to pull it open. Your brain and muscles are perfectly poised to help you achieve this goal. First, your brain sends a signal to motor neurons inside your arm. When they receive this message, they fire, causing muscles to contract and relax, which pull on the bones in your arm and generate the needed movement. The bigger the challenge becomes, the bigger the brain's signal grows, and the more motor units it rallies to help you achieve your task. But what if the door is made of solid iron? At this point, your arm muscles alone won't be able to generate enough tension to pull it open, so your brain appeals to other muscles for help. You plant your feet, tighten your belly, and tense your back, generating enough force to yank it open. Your nervous system has just leveraged the resources you already have, other muscles, to meet the demand. While all this is happening, your muscle fibers undergo another kind of cellular change. As you expose them to stress, they experience microscopic damage, which in this context is a good thing. In response, the injured cells release inflammatory molecules called cytokines that activate the immune system to repair the injury. This is when the muscle-building magic happens. The greater the damage to the muscle tissue, the more your body will need to repair itself. The resulting cycle of damage and repair eventually makes muscles bigger and stronger as they adapt to progressively greater demands. Since our bodies have already adapted to most everyday activities, those generally don't produce enough stress to stimulate new muscle growth. So to build new muscle, a process called hypertrophy, our cells need to be exposed to higher workloads than they are used to. In fact, if you don't continuously expose your muscles to some resistance, they will shrink, a process known as muscular atrophy. In contrast, exposing the muscle to a high degree of tension, especially while the muscle is lengthening, also called an eccentric contraction, generates effective conditions for new growth. However, muscles rely on more than just activity to grow. Without proper nutrition, hormones, and rest, your body would never be able to repair damaged muscle fibers. Protein in our diet preserves muscle mass by providing the building blocks for new tissue, in the form of amino acids. Adequate protein intake, along with naturally occurring hormones like insulin-like growth factor and testosterone, help shift the body into a state where tissue is repaired and grown. This vital repair process mainly occurs when we're resting, especially at night while sleeping. Gender and age affect this repair mechanism, which is why young men with more testosterone have a leg up in the muscle building game. Genetic factors also play a role in one's ability to grow muscle. Some people have more robust immune reactions to muscle damage and are better able to repair and replace damaged muscle fibers, increasing their muscle building potential. The body responds to the demands you place on it. If you tear your muscles up, eat right, rest, and repeat, you'll create the conditions to make your muscles as big and strong as possible. It is with muscles as it is with life. Meaningful growth requires challenge and stress.
I love that video so much, mostly because of that quote at the end. That is my favorite quote ever. It is with muscles as it is with life. Meaningful growth requires challenge and stress. That's why, again, we call it training, not just working out, you know? We're training to get better at stuff. Your muscles will experience inflammation as like a response thanks to your immune system, and because you have damaged those myofibrils, right? So when you damage those myofibrils, the actin-myosin proteins, by using them, right, they're peeling and, you know, they're getting kind of burnt up and beat up a little bit, right? Your immune system will come along and repair them. You're also generating lots of lactic acid, right? So type 2 muscle fibers, which primarily rely on lactic acid for their, you know, fuel production, right? Build up that lactic acid, which causes like this burning sensation within our muscles. We get that burning sensation, right? As it's sort of being built up, you know, that burning is coming from, yeah, cellular damage, you know, like there's definitely, oops, oh, my computer's lagging. There's definitely like a little bit of burning because, you know, it's acid, right? You're pouring acid onto your muscles. It's damaging them. So your body's going to go, crap, I gotta fix that, you know? There are some fun cardiovascular adaptations here. We call them hemodynamic adaptations. And so like your heart rate obviously does increase as you exercise and lift resistance training. Obviously, it's not the same as doing like sustained bouts of cardio, but you are still doing a little bit of like, you know, elevated heart rate training there. So your heart rate will increase, or maybe it'll stay the same depending on how you're doing your strength training. That can have a positive impact on your stroke volume, which is the, you know, amount of blood that's pumped every time your heart beats. And then also we know that like you'll develop more mitochondria in response. That will increase your VO2 max. So as long as there's like the right type of stress, you can see like major improvements in your cardiorespiratory system. And also you'll see a decrease in cholesterol levels, which is great for your freaking heart. You get those two types of cholesterol, right? LDL, which is the bad stuff, and HDL, which is the good stuff. HDL literally comes along and eats up the bad stuff. And it's in charge of like taking some of those lipoproteins into your cells and converting them into like different hormones. If you're producing lots of hormones in response to exercise, which we do, right? When we exercise, you know, we're generating higher levels of testosterone. That's both men and women. Growth hormone, IGF-1, all those things. And so those hormones are coming from like your cholesterol cells. So if you're worried about too much cholesterol in your body, exercise burns it up and uses it elsewhere. And so then it doesn't have a chance to kind of build up, you know, turn into plaque and clog our arteries. So, and lastly, any questions on that before we move into our final section here? All righty. Let's talk about flexibility. Can't talk about resistance training without talking about learning how to stretch as well. So maintaining proper range of motion and proper flexibility, super freaking important. Otherwise, you're going to move the wrong way, or you move the wrong way, you're going to get an overuse injury. You get an overuse injury, Yeah, probably lead to another overuse injury. So really quickly, quick review of anatomy here. Talking about flexibility, inside of all of your muscles, you have a couple sensory receptors, right? These are, we call them mechanoreceptors, right? They're receptors that sense changes in mechanical or physical things, right? Physical movement. So some of these are going to be muscle spindles, Golgi tendon organs, and joint receptors, right? So the muscle spindles are the sensory receptors that are sensitive to the changes in the length of the muscle, right? So if this is the muscle, and then this section down here is the tendon, your muscle spindle lives throughout your muscle, and it's basically just there to like a coil, and when it's like, you know, compressed versus stretched, and so it's sending a signal to your brain saying, hey brain, where, you know, if I got my arm stretched out like this, my bicep is being fully stretched out right now, versus here my bicep is being fully contracted, right? So if I'm here, I'm at halfway between those two, my muscle spindle is sending a signal to my brain saying, hey brain, we're at about 50% max length right now. And now my brain knows what position my arm is in, right? My nervous system knows where my body is. That's my proprioception, right? You've also got Golgi tendon organs. These are the sensory receptors that live in the tendon of the muscle, right? Their job is to sense how much tension there is and whether or not it's about to tear or if it's about to like release from the bone, right? And so like it's saying, yeah, well, we're fully stretched out right now. There's a little bit of tension. Right here, there's not very much tension because it's very compacted, right? So Golgi tendon organs tell your brain how much tension there is. If the tension is really, really high, it will do everything it can to kind of protect that muscle, whether that's contracting a muscle spindle or relaxing it, which we're going to see in a second. And then there are joint receptors as well. These are receptors that are kind of living in the joints themselves. They're saying to your brain and your nervous system how fast you're either accelerating or how fast you're, you know, decelerating. So pressure changes, acceleration, deceleration, things like that. So static stretches. If we're talking about the different types of stretches that we've got out there, right? We have got active isolated stretches, static stretches, and dynamic stretches. Those are typically the ones we spend our time talking about. So a static stretch is kind of what you think of when you think of stretching. Like if I were to just kind of pull my head over here and I just held this for like 30 seconds straight and I just kind of hold myself here, right? Eventually my muscle is going to kind of relax. This nice big long stretch right here is known as a static stretch. It's pretty easy to remember, and it's like you're static, you're not moving, right? You move through your range of motion and then you just kind of hold it there, right? Those are static stretches. So sometimes you'll hold it for up to 2 minutes every now and then, you know, but basically you're lengthening a muscle out beyond its normal resting length. So what's happening in a static stretch, right? If you're holding it for at least 30 seconds, the minute you go under that static stretch, the minute you start to static stretch, the minute you start to static stretch, your body will, a couple things will happen, right? First, you're pulling one muscle into maximum length because you're stretching, right? So when you pull it into maximum length, your nervous system freaks out because that muscle spindle freaks out. The muscle spindle is saying, wow, I'm being pulled to full length. That means the muscle could tear, right? Meanwhile, the Golgi tendon organ's going, yeah, because you're pulling on the muscle, that's also pulling on the tendon. So now the Golgi tendon organ's also saying, wow, there's a lot of tension here. If we have this much tension, we could tear off the bone, we could tear the muscle, right? So your body starts to kind of freak out. Now, if you continue sustaining that, you know, it's like the Golgi tendon organ's like, hey, brain, what did I say? I said, if you keep doing this, we're going to tear, right? So this is why it kind of feels uncomfortable when you're stretching. You're like, oh, you know, and it feels like that big kind of painful sensation that you're experiencing. Well, if you sustain that pressure for an extended period of time, 30 seconds, maybe sometimes even 2 minutes, what will happen is this physiologic process called autogenic inhibition, right? So static stretches will trigger autogenic inhibition because it's sustained pressure on that Golgi tendon organ, right? That Golgi tendon organ living in here. If you stretch this muscle out, this is going to say, wow, we are really stretched. Now what that'll do is it's got to find a way to protect you, right? It's going to try to find a way to protect you. So what it'll do, it'll tell the brain, hey, the tension's really high. You got to tell the muscle spindle to let go. So then it will send a signal back over to here, to your muscle spindle, telling it to relax. And if you relax that muscle, well, now there's all the tendon can kind of relax because it's not, the muscle was trying to contract, and now the muscle relaxes into a deeper length than it was before. That's autogenic inhibition. So the pressure on a Golgi tendon organ inhibits the muscle spindle, causing the muscle to relax. It's a it's like, if you're going to keep pulling like this, then I'm going to relax the muscle in response. That happens in foam rolling and massage as well. Whenever you do like myofascial release and you're pressing on like a Golgi, you'll notice a lot of times like a lot of massages are kind of near the joints. And the reason for that is because they're pressing on those Golgi tendon organs. Unless you have like a node, in which the case they feel a knot, then that's usually in the belly of the muscle. And you'll also use autogenic inhibition there. You'll press on the muscle spindle, which will say, oh my God. And then it will say, all right, well, if we relax, maybe there won't be so much tension and we won't tear in half. One that's not mentioned in this PowerPoint are our active stretches. Active isolated stretches are stretches that actually move you through full ranges of eccentric motion, so that moves through that eccentric lengthening action. And you do that by contracting the antagonist muscle, right? If you contract your antagonist for 1 to 2 seconds, right? If I were to contract my right side of my neck, my antagonist is the left side of my neck. So if I contract like this, that draws the left side into a stretch, right? So if I did it again, and if I did it again, right? What I'm doing there is I'm drawing this muscle into a stretch by using active isolated stretches. If I held that for 1 to 2 seconds, and if I did it for about 5 to 10 repetitions, that will create what is called reciprocal inhibition. Now, that's not necessarily going to cause this to relax simply because it's like inhibiting it directly. Instead, it's inhibiting it sort of indirectly, right? So I'm contracting this muscle, and my nervous system is designed, whenever I contract an agonist, its antagonist will relax. So if I'm saying contract, 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 what I'm really saying is relax, 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 right? So that's reciprocal inhibition. Contracting one muscle, and the antagonist reciprocates that by letting go. And then we've got dynamic stretches, which are stretches that aren't necessarily designed to actually improve your flexibility. They're just drawing your muscles through a full range of motion to get them ready for exercise. So these are stretches that usually use momentum and a little bit of like active muscular effort there. These are really great because they also, if you do them, they're body weight exercises that involve like eccentric and concentric contractions. So it's a little bit of like gentle working out. And so your heart rate will go up. That'll increase your cardiac output. It'll increase oxygen delivery to your muscles. This is one of the best ways to exercise before you start training, right? Because it really does kind of prep your body, get you nice and warm. But is it used for improving your actual like range of motion? Not so much. That is something it's not great at. So dynamic stretches often use an entire like stretch shortening cycle. We stretch one and then that shortens that muscle, right, in response. Dynamic stretches, really, really good for that. Not so good at like making you more flexible though. Just not, we're not doing anything to increase the length of the muscle permanently, Now there is one type of stretching that we haven't mentioned yet, that also falls under corrective flexibility. So this would be used in phase like 1 and maybe even in phase 2. But this is your PNF stretching, okay? And PNF stretching stands for peripheral neuromuscular facilitation, or I guess they're saying proprioceptive neuromuscular facilitation, PNF. Basically what it is you are going to stretch, and by the way, this typically requires like a partner, although not always, but you are going to stretch your muscle through a full range of motion statically. You're going to get a little bit of autogenic inhibition. Then you are going to alternate contracting and relaxing the agonist and antagonist muscles in order to hopefully trigger a little bit of reciprocal inhibition as well. And so what'll happen you can see like here in this picture, this trainer is moving this muscle through a full range of motion. So he is dorsiflexing the ankle, which is going to stretch the calf, right? He's going to hold that for about 20 to 30 seconds under a static stretch. And then she's going to isometrically contract for about 20 to 25% of her maximum effort for about anywhere from 3 to 15 seconds. I like 10 seconds. So she does 10 seconds there. And then you tell her to relax, wait 1 to 2 seconds, and then you're going to passively move that limb through like a new deeper range of motion. And you're going to repeat that for anywhere from 2 to 3 sets, or for 1 to 3 sets, right? That is, really effective, right? And then this is actually pulled out of your corrective exercise textbook. This is the little chart that will show you how to do it. So 1 to 3 reps of a 7 to 15 second contraction, and a 20 to 30 second stretch. And then you're really not doing this for like maximum effort. So if someone were to stretch my arms back like this, and they were holding them back there, that would statically stretch out my chest. And then if they told me to contract it for 10 seconds, and then I do, and then they say relax, and then I stretch into a deeper range of motion, right? That is how we do that. There's a lot of really good examples of this that Mo's going to teach you inside of the corrective exercise class. You're going to learn a lot of these fun techniques for stretching people through full ranges of motion. And like I said, you're going to take advantage of both autogenic inhibition as well as reciprocal inhibition. And PNF's not for everybody. Make sure you don't do it with any clients who have like osteoporosis, rheumatoid arthritis. Regular arthritis can be okay, but rheumatoid arthritis should be avoided. If they have an injury, a lot of times people will jump into PNF stretching right away, and it's like, no, don't do that. You want to give your body a little bit of time to heal, before you actually start stretching it out. If they've had like a joint replacement or anything like that, be aware of that as well. And hypertensive clients. Avoid any clients who have high blood pressure, because again, there's an isometric contraction involved. A little bit of a quicker one today, but that is about it, guys. Any questions for me today? Lorianne, Bay, how you guys feeling?
Good. Everything's good.
Cool.
Thanks, Brad.
Yeah. All right, guys.
Have a good day, Bay.
Yeah,
Bye.
you too. See you tomorrow.
Bye, guys. Thank you. Bye.
Yeah. See ya.